The Roaring Twenties. To understand why it's called the Roaring Twenties, we first have to understand how Americans and most people who speak English refer to dates. So if you see here, the number is 1,920. But that is too much, and Americans are lazy. So instead, we break the number down into two parts, 19 and 20. This is how Americans read it. We read it first as the first number, 19, then as the second number, 20. But since we are talking about the years from 1920 to 1929, we need to add the S at the end. So 1920. So the 1920s. The 1920s are often called the Roaring Twenties. The word roar comes from the sound that a lion makes when he makes his presence known. Similarly, the roar of the 1920s was this idea that American culture was exploding with all of these new things. People were partying more, people were having a good time. The 1920s was a super expansive period of American culture. The definition that I have for the 1920s, which we've covered already, is a period of time from 1920 to 1929 when many people lived in a wild and lively way. So what caused the 1920s? Well, we have to look first at what was happening right before the 1920s. At the end of 1918, the First World War came to an end, and people were excited to get back to life as they knew it before the war. They wanted to get back to some sense of normal life. So that contributed to this rise in American culture because people were so relieved that they had survived this world war. And the economy responded to this new sense of relief. The American economy responded with an economic boom. There are three parts of the Roaring Twenties that we are going to look at. The first part I want to look at is culture. The second part is technology. Now, with technology, we tend to think of computers and other things that use electricity, but it really could be any innovation. To represent this, I decided to use these gears instead of the computers to help show us that technology could be really any innovation. I hope that this icon, this picture, can help us expand our definition of what technology is. The last section we're going to look at is politics. But first, we're going to address culture. One of the first things that came out of the culture of the 1920s was a new type of art that artists at the time had started to use. This type of art is called Art Deco. Art Deco has a lot of straight lines and strong geometric shapes. You can see it in these pictures. Although there are some moving lines, for example in her hair or in some of the pictures behind her, there are a lot of clear geometric shapes, right? We see the triangles here and we see the rectangles over there. That is Art Deco. Another part of culture at the time was music. Jazz, the most popular form of music in the 1920s, first came from the African American community. Now, jazz had a very distinct sound, and this is because jazz uses what is called swing or swing music. Swing music gives different durations or lengths of time to the eighth note values, and I'll show you that here in a minute. Louis Armstrong was one of the more famous people to create and popularize jazz. Movies were also a huge part of American culture. And at the start of the 1920s, movies were mostly silent films. But by the middle of the 1920s, Hollywood started to make movies with sound. They called these talkies because people were often talking in the movie. These movies were shown all over the country, and in some cases, all over the world. Hollywood's new fame reflected a major change in the trend of American life. Now, it's important to note that as these different forms of art became more popular, right? Art Deco became more popular, jazz became more popular, movies became more popular. As the popularity and the number of these different types of art and different types of media grew, so did the opportunity for everybody else. This expansion of culture allowed for more people to participate in the American cultural expression. One of the biggest areas in the world that participated in this cultural expansion and explosion of the 1920s was in Harlem. Now, Harlem is a small neighborhood in New York City. At this time, they called this the Harlem Renaissance. They called it this because Harlem is where it was happening, but they called it Renaissance because it was a rebirth of new ideas, very similar to the Italian Renaissance. Many African American artists, writers, and musicians lived in this one area of New York City called Harlem. Here they made new styles of art, music, and writing, and one of the main features of this art was the telling of the story of the American experience. And in their work, these African Americans were able to open the door for many other people of color and other African Americans to participate in this American cultural expression. Now, I also wanted to take time to show you this map. This map shows you first, obviously, the United States, but as we start to zoom in, you can see New Jersey, where I'm from, Massachusetts up here, and we can see New York City right there in the middle. And as we zoom in, you start to see New York City, and you can see really how massive and huge New York City is. And as we can start to see that this right here is the area of Harlem. So it's a really small part of this massive city. But that really helped the Harlem Renaissance take off. Now, just to show you some examples, 3 of the most famous artists at this time were Louis Armstrong, a famous jazz musician and trumpet player, Langston Hughes, a famous writer during the 1920s, and Billie Holiday, who was a famous singer at the time. Now, another cultural development was that dance also became popular. There were 3 main types of dance: the Charleston, the Peabody, and the Turkey Trot. These types of dances, which I'll show you in a minute in the video, were seen as scandalous. This was because people thought that if people were dancing, then they were going to be immoral. And if they're going to be immoral, they're going to be drinking and probably having sex before they're even married. All of these horrible and scary things. Now, today we look at even their dancing and we say, that's not so scandalous, that's not crazy, that's normal. But at the time, it was considered very scandalous. One of the changes as part of this shift in culture was the flapper. The flapper, which was a young woman in the 1920s who dressed or behaved in a way that was very modern. There were 2 things that they did that were considered modern and made them so modern to call them flappers. The first was their haircuts. They cut their hair very short. Some people even made fun of them, saying that they were trying to cut their hair to look like guys. The second was that they started to wear skirts that showed their legs and ankles. Some women even went further, and in this picture you can see that they're all showing their shoulders. All of this was seen as very scandalous, or almost inappropriate at the time. But it's important to note that this was a point when women started to express themselves and push back against the conservative culture of the time. One of the other things that I think is very interesting is that homosexuality became more visible at this time. actors and actresses who were gay started to appear and perform in movies and music. Some who were gay also started to get the opportunity to perform on stage. There were even movies and songs written about LGBTQ+ persons. On top of that, some of the first gay and lesbian communities started in Harlem and in Greenwich Village in New York City. Now, that's not to say that discrimination was eliminated. In fact, discrimination continued. For example, Mae West, a famous actress at the time, you can see her picture here, was put in prison because she wrote a play about homosexuality called The Drag. This is also happening alongside a lot of violence that continued against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer people. And to make matters worse, many LGBTQ+ people were killed and lynched for just being who they were. One of the other important aspects of the cultural boom at this time was that sports became really popular. The most famous example, and one we know today, is that baseball became popular. Babe Ruth became one of the most famous baseball players of all time. It's important to take note that the demographics of America also started to change during the 1920s. Many African Americans wanted new lives, and they wanted to work in the factories in the North. So they moved north to cities like Seattle, Chicago, Detroit, Boston, and New York. Another reason that they moved was because of racism and poverty in the South. Now, both racism and poverty forced many African Americans to seek new opportunities. Also during this time, many Hispanics and Latinos were attracted to cities like Los Angeles and other cities that were closer to the border with Mexico. So many Spanish speakers moved into Los Angeles that they actually developed a distinct district where people mainly spoke Spanish. This district they called the barrio. And in English, barrio is neighborhood. Now moving on to technology. At this time, movies became revolutionized. As I mentioned before, the new technology that allowed for the recording of sound changed the silent moving pictures to moving pictures with sound. This made movies far more popular. This, along with the booming economy and movie theaters being built across the country, allowed for Hollywood to become the movie-making capital of the United States, but also of the world. In the picture, you can see the old Hollywoodland sign. Now, over time, that has been changed to just say Hollywood and can still be seen today. Another technological advancement would be the radio. Many people started buying and listening to the radio at this time. Soon, the radio became one of the first forms of mass media in the United States. The effect of this new mass media was that it created a sense of shared culture, which is very similar to how TV and social media are today. One of the other technological advances has two parts, and it's the car. Now, the car had existed before World War I, before the Roaring Twenties. But before World War I, cars were seen as a luxury item that few could actually afford. Then came Henry Ford. He used assembly lines or production lines to increase productivity. Now, you can see in the animated GIF, the worker stays in one place while the different parts of the building process are brought to them. So assembly lines or production lines are a line of machines, equipment, or workers in a factory that builds the product by passing the work from one station to the next station until the product is finished. The result of Henry Ford using assembly lines was that cars became much, much cheaper. And by making them much cheaper, people in the United States were able to actually afford them and were able to purchase them. So many Americans were able to buy cars in the 1920s that by the end of 1929, the United States had just under 27 million registered automobiles. The last part of the 1920s that I want to talk about is politics. But there are a few important things to know before we start. The first is that the Constitution of the United States, or really any country, the Constitution is the system of beliefs and laws by which a country or a state or organization is governed. So here we have a picture of the Constitution of the United States of America. Now, an amendment is a change in the words or meaning of a law or document, such as the Constitution. So after the Constitution was passed, it wasn't perfect, and the United States had to amend their laws or change the laws to help perfect that system of government that we have in America. And to do that, they used amendments. The 18th Amendment was the prohibition of alcohol in the United States. Now, the word prohibition just means the act of not allowing something to be used or done. So by the end of 1920, it was illegal to make or drink alcohol. Now, this did have some positive effects. The biggest positive effect was that Americans drank a lot less alcohol. As we know, too much alcohol is bad for your health, bad for your body. You can see here on the picture, people who were in favor of prohibition would put up these signs telling you how bad alcohol abuse is. But the 18th Amendment also had some negative effects. The most significant negative effect was an increase in crime and violence. And this makes sense, right? If alcohol is illegal and you still want some, you're going to have to participate in criminal activity or violence. But if it's legal, you can just go to the store and buy alcohol. You don't need to resort to crime and violence. In the 1920s, the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. This gave women suffrage in 1920. Now, suffrage sounds like suffering, but it's really a different word. Suffrage is just the right to vote in an election. So women before the 1920s were not able to vote. They spent years protesting and fighting for the right to vote, and for equality more generally. But by the end of 1920, they got the right to vote. Yes! But were they equal? Did they get equality? Not really. Even at the time, there was still only a limited opportunity for many women. Women struggled to find work outside of the house. And if they did, they were somewhat limited to jobs like secretaries, teachers, or nurses. Basically, women were limited to jobs that were thought of as women's work. So it's important to remember that in the 1920s, the 19th Amendment was passed that gave women the right to vote, but it didn't guarantee them equality and fair treatment. So that's the overview of the 1920s, or the Roaring Twenties. And I hope that this helped you understand the culture, technology, and politics that were all happening in the 1920s.